If you stand in the Guyanese jungle today, near the overgrown clearing where Jonestown once stood, it's hard to imagine that nearly 1,000 people once called this patch of land home. Back in the late 1970s, the air here would have been full of sound. Kids laughing, hammers pounding, sermons blaring over loudspeakers, the crackle of jungle insects in the background, while a Midwestern preacher's voice promised a new world. He told them they were building a socialist paradise. He told them they were escaping racism, capitalism, and the violence of America. He told them he loved them more than anyone ever would. And on November 18, 1978, he told them to die. To understand how hundreds of mostly American citizens ended up in a remote commune in Guyana, lining up to drink poison as armed guards watched, we have to start decades earlier, in a tiny Indiana town, with a boy named Jimmy Jones. James Warren Jones was born in 1931 in Crete, Indiana, and grew up in nearby Lynn. His childhood was marked by poverty and a distant, often sick father, but also by an early obsession with religion and race. People who knew him as a kid said he was strange, intense. He'd hold funerals for pets in the neighborhood, preach to whoever would listen, and hang around black neighborhoods in a time and place where that was absolutely not considered acceptable. He got a front-row seat to how raw American racism was in the 1930s and 40s. For a white kid who seemed to genuinely hate segregation, the black church became a kind of spiritual home. He saw firsthand what it meant for a community to have a place where they were respected, fed, and seen. He also saw how much power a charismatic preacher could have over that community. In the 1950s, Jones got ordained and started his own congregation in Indianapolis. He blended old-school Pentecostal energy, healing services, speaking in tongues, intense altar calls, with progressive politics. This was the height of Jim Crow. Most white churches were segregated. Jones very deliberately did the opposite. He built what looked, from the outside, like a miracle, a racially integrated church filled with black and white members worshiping side by side. He adopted children of different races and called his family a rainbow family. He took in folks down on their luck, fed the hungry, and opened social programs for seniors and the poor. If you're an American watching this, imagine a pastor in the 1950s Midwest who's preaching not just Jesus but full-on racial equality and socialism from the pulpit. For a lot of people who felt shut out by the system, especially black families, single moms, people with disabilities, that was magnetic. This was the birth of People's Temple. And in the beginning, for some people, it really did change their lives for the better. Jones helped addicts get sober. He found housing for people who'd been sleeping on the street. He stood up publicly against segregation. He took busloads of congregants to protests. If the story ended there, Jim Jones would be a footnote in civil rights history, a radical pastor who made racists mad and made poor folks feel seen. But power has gravity. As the temple grew, so did Jones' ego and paranoia. He didn't just want to be a pastor who pointed to God. He wanted to be the one his followers looked at when they said the word Savior. He started mixing Christianity with his own brand of Marxist, revolutionary rhetoric. He'd talk about Jesus and socialism in the same sentence, and gradually blur the line between loyalty to God, loyalty to the cause, and loyalty to Jim. In the early 1960s, fearful of nuclear war and drawn by more liberal politics, he moved the temple to California, first to Redwood Valley up north, then expanding into San Francisco and Los Angeles. California in the 60s and 70s was a perfect place for a group like this to grow. Anti-war activism, civil rights struggles, and a sense that the old ways were dying. People's Temple ran free meal programs, medical clinics, and housing co-ops. Members donated their paychecks to the church and lived in communal homes. Jones railed against racism and capitalism and positioned the temple as the vanguard of a better world. Politicians in San Francisco saw thousands of loyal temple members who'd show up to rallies and vote as a bloc. Jones became a player in local politics, even landing a spot as chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority, a powerful position for someone who claimed to speak for the poor. From the outside, a lot of people saw a progressive, multiracial church doing real good. Inside, something much darker was taking shape. Jones demanded total commitment. Members were encouraged or pressured to sign over their assets, deeds to their homes, custody of their children. Confession sessions, called catharsis or self-criticism, turned into public humiliations. People who questioned him were shouted down, slapped, or beaten in front of the group. Couples were split up. Jones would decide who could be with whom. He took sexual control of members' lives, sleeping with both women and men and framing it as a kind of revolutionary intimacy. He also manufactured crises to test loyalty. One of the most infamous tactics was the White Knight. In the middle of the night, he'd order a full emergency meeting. Exhausted members would drag themselves to the church, where Jones would warn them that fascists were coming, or that the government was about to round them up. He'd pass out cups of red liquid, tell them it was poison, and ask them to drink it to prove their commitment. They'd do it. Then he'd laugh it off and admit it was a loyalty test. Imagine what that does to your ability to trust your own fear. Your body screams at you not to drink. Everyone around you is drinking. You drink. You don't die. The leader laughs and says, "See? I was testing your faith." A piece of you learns to override your survival instinct in order to stay with the group. By the mid-1970s, pressure from the outside was building. Some former members began to speak out about abuse and coercion. Families of Temple members formed a group called Concerned Relatives and started lobbying politicians and journalists, saying, "Our kids and grandkids are being held, manipulated, even beaten. Help us." Critical stories started appearing in the press. Jones' response was classic high-control group behavior: isolate the flock. He told his followers that America was sliding into fascism, that concentration camps were coming, that the FBI and CIA were out to destroy them because they were a successful socialist, interracial community. He needed somewhere out of reach of U.S. law, somewhere he could maintain total control without pesky reporters and court orders. Guyana, a small English-speaking country on the northern coast of South America, looked perfect. It had a socialist-leaning government, plenty of jungle land, and a desire for foreign investment. In the mid-70s, People's Temple leased around 3,800 acres in the northwest part of the country and began building what they called the People's Temple Agricultural Project. Everyone else called it Jonestown. For American viewers, picture this: a group from San Francisco and LA, many of whom had never left the United States, suddenly find themselves in dense tropical jungle. No nearby towns. No paved roads. Supplies come by boat or small plane. The nearest airstrip is miles away at a place called Port Kaituma, basically a dirt strip carved out of the trees. Jones sold Jonestown to his followers as a utopia. There were glossy brochures, photos of smiling members planting gardens, kids splashing in rivers, rows of neat cottages. He talked about growing their own food, building a model socialist community where racism and inequality were relics of the outside world. For some Temple members, especially black families who'd experienced discrimination and police brutality in the U.S., the idea of starting over in a place where they could live without that daily grind was incredibly appealing. So they went. By 1978, over 900 Temple members were living in Jonestown. They were mostly American, seniors who'd left behind pensions and Social Security checks, young adults idealistic about building a new world, kids who had no say in the matter, and a few die-hard inner circle members who believed Jim Jones had almost godlike insight. On paper, they were overseas missionaries and agricultural workers. On the ground, life was harsh. The soil wasn't as fertile as advertised. The tropical heat was brutal. Housing was cramped, often dozens of people sleeping in long wooden dorms with bunk beds, thin mattresses, and little privacy. Mosquitoes and disease were constant. And then there was the schedule. The workday was long, dawn to dusk in the fields, kitchens, or construction crews. After dinner, instead of rest, there were hours of meetings where people sat on hard benches under a tin roof while Jones preached, ranted, and played tapes of himself over loudspeakers. Those loudspeakers never really turned off. People woke up and fell asleep to Jim Jones' voice, blasting sermons, news commentary, and warnings about the outside world. He controlled information tightly. American news was filtered through his commentary, painting the U.S. as collapsing into fascism, race war, and nuclear disaster. He presented himself as the only one who understood what was really happening and the only one who could protect them. Letters home were censored or dictated. Visitors were rare and supervised. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, ostensibly to protect the settlement from enemies, but also to keep people from leaving. Punishments were harsh. People who broke rules could be put in the box, a small wooden isolation cell, or forced to do hard labor. Children and adults were beaten. Public shaming sessions continued, with troublemakers put in the hot seat while the group criticized them. Those midnight white knights followed them to Guyana. Jones would claim that mercenaries or CIA agents were coming through the jungle. Sirens would blare. Everyone had to rush to the pavilion, the central gathering space. Sometimes he'd stage a mock attack, gunfire sounds played over speakers, to see how people reacted. Sometimes he'd talk about revolutionary suicide, the idea that dying on their own terms was better than being taken by enemies. At the same time, the temple ran things that really did look like a functioning small town. There was a school, a medical clinic, a radio room, farming operations. Kids sang songs about socialism. Elderly members sat in the shade and told stories. For some who'd come from violent neighborhoods or extreme poverty, Jonestown felt safer in certain ways. They didn't see the beatings and punishments as abuse. They saw them as discipline in service of a bigger cause. That's part of what makes this so chilling. Jonestown wasn't a cartoon. It was a mix of real community and real horror, and that mixture made it easier for people to rationalize the abuse. Meanwhile, back in the States, concerned relatives were raising the alarm louder. They collected statements from defectors who'd escaped Jonestown, describing passports being taken, guards with guns, people being held against their will. They pressured the U.S. government to investigate. Enter Congressman Leo Ryan. Ryan represented a district in California that included parts of the Bay Area, where People's Temple had been active. He had a reputation for hands-on investigations. This is a guy who once took a job as a substitute teacher to look into school conditions, and another time had himself locked up in Folsom Prison to understand what inmates experienced. When concerned relatives came to him about Jonestown, he took it seriously. In November 1978, he put together a fact-finding delegation. Staffers, reporters, concerned relatives, and a few others. They flew to Guyana, met officials in Georgetown, and arranged to visit Jonestown. Jones knew he was coming. In the days leading up to the visit, you can imagine the panic in that jungle community. For Jones, this wasn't just a PR problem, it was an existential threat. If a U.S. congressman went back and reported abuse, Jones could lose his people, his power, and possibly face criminal charges. He ordered the place cleaned up. Best behavior. Smiles. Extra food. He rehearsed members on what to say. Dissenters were kept out of sight or placed under tighter control. On November 17, 1978, Ryan and his party flew to the remote Port Kaituma airstrip and traveled by truck to Jonestown. The welcome, at least at first, was cordial. There was music, a big meal, speeches. Visitors saw people dancing, kids playing, old folks being treated kindly. On camera, some members praised the community, saying they'd never been happier. But cracks showed quickly. That night, a temple member slipped a note to one of the visiting reporters, NBC correspondent Don Harris. "Help us get out of Jonestown," it said, signed by a small group of people who wanted to defect. For Jones, that was the nightmare scenario. People asking to leave in front of an outsider with a camera. The next day, more people quietly approached the visitors, saying they wanted to go. By November 18th, Ryan's group had a list of defectors who wanted to leave with them, a couple dozen in all. Jones tried to talk them out of it. There's footage from that day. He looked sweaty, drained, his once fiery tone now slurred, likely from heavy drug use. He frames leaving as betrayal, not just of him, but of the entire community and their ideals. When that didn't work, he agreed, at least outwardly, to let them go. As the defectors and the delegation headed back to the trucks to return to the airstrip, tension was thick. Some temple members cried, others glared. Families were split. Not everyone could agree on what to do. The sense of being trapped, physically and psychologically, was suddenly very real. At the airstrip, as people boarded two small planes, a tractor with a trailer pulled up carrying armed temple loyalists. They opened fire. Congressman Leo Ryan was shot and killed. So were Don Harris, NBC soundman Bob Brown, photographer Greg Robinson, and temple defector Patty Parks. Several others were wounded, including Ryan's aide Jackie Spear, who survived by playing dead after being shot multiple times. That attack at Port Kaituma was the point of no return. Back at Jonestown, Jones spun it as proof that their enemies would never stop, that the U.S. government would come now for sure, that there was no way out. What followed has been referred to, over the years, as mass suicide, mass murder, murder-suicide, and massacre. None of those phrases fully capture the horror, or the complicated mix of coercion, fear, indoctrination, and force at play. In the central pavilion, under the corrugated metal roof that had hosted so many long meetings, a large vat of grape-flavored drink was prepared. Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid, although that's the brand that made it into the American idiom. Mixed into it were massive amounts of potassium cyanide and sedatives. Jones gathered the community. We know what he said because an audio cassette was recording. He framed what was about to happen as revolutionary suicide, a political act, a refusal to let the world they'd fled take their children and torture them. He painted lurid images of soldiers coming, of kids being ripped from parents' arms, of their utopia being burned to the ground. People cried, argued, pleaded. One woman, Christine Miller, bravely challenged him, arguing that they should try to go to Russia, to Cuba, anywhere rather than die. Jones shut her down, and others in the crowd shouted her down, too, a grim example of how peer pressure in a closed group can silence even the most reasonable dissent. Armed guards surrounded the pavilion. Mothers were told to bring their children forward first. Eyewitnesses who survived described kids being given syringes of the poison by mouth, squeezed into their throats. Babies and toddlers had it squirted in with droppers. Some adults drank from paper cups. Others had poison forced into them. At least 70 people were injected, often against their will. Those who resisted were met with intimidation, physical force, or the threat and reality of guns. In total, 909 people died in Jonestown that day, all but 2 from cyanide poisoning. A third of them were children. When you add the murders at the airstrip and the temple-related deaths in Georgetown, the toll for November 18, 1978, reaches 918. It remains one of the deadliest single losses of American civilian life in a non-natural disaster. Jim Jones himself did not drink the poison. He died from a gunshot wound to the head, whether self-inflicted or at someone else's hand has never been fully settled. In any case, he died quickly, surrounded by the bodies of people who had believed him when he said he was their protector. The images that emerged in the days that followed shocked the world. Guyanese soldiers and American officials flew into the jungle to find a scene that defied comprehension. Hundreds of bodies, many in matching shirts and jeans, lying face down around the pavilion and across the compound. Cups, syringes, and vats of purple liquid scattered among them. The jungle air hot and thick and filled with the smell of death. Back in the U.S., news anchors tried to describe it in real time. Families watched, scanning blurry footage for faces they recognized, trying to process that their loved ones weren't just dead. They'd died in an act that, in its early reporting, was framed as a willing suicide pact. In the decades since, survivors and scholars have pushed back hard against that narrative. Yes, some adult members believed in Jones' rhetoric enough that they chose to drink. Others were coerced, threatened, or physically forced. Many were in a state of profound psychological dependence, where the idea of living without the group felt impossible. And the children had no choice at all. Calling it simply mass suicide misses the layers of manipulation, abuse, and outright murder involved. It also feeds into one of the most misunderstood parts of this story, the idea that those people were just crazy, or only gullible idiots join cults. The reality is far more uncomfortable. Many People's Temple members were smart, politically engaged, and deeply idealistic. They joined because they wanted to fight racism, feed the hungry, and build a better world. Jones exploited those values. He didn't start with cyanide. He started with free meals, civil rights marches, and healing services. He built loyalty with real acts of kindness and community, then gradually layered in control techniques. Sleep deprivation, public shaming, isolation from outsiders, control of money and movement, constant fear messaging, and the creation of an us versus them worldview where leaving meant death or damnation. By the time he was talking about revolutionary suicide, people had spent years repeating slogans, doing loyalty tests, and turning to him for every major decision. Their ability to imagine a life outside his control had been systematically dismantled. That's how you get hundreds of people in a pavilion in the jungle, many of them physically and emotionally exhausted, facing armed guards and a leader they've been taught to equate with God. From an American perspective, Jonestown also forced some hard conversations about responsibility. People's Temple didn't grow in a vacuum. It flourished in part because mainstream churches were segregated and indifferent to the poor, because politicians were happy to welcome a charismatic pastor who could deliver votes without asking too many questions, because government agencies were slow to act on reports of abuse, and because most of us have a tendency to look away from communities that seem strange or uncomfortable until it's too late. It also left us with a phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid. People toss it around casually to mean blindly following a trend or buying into a corporate culture. It's become a joke in office meetings and online arguments. But that metaphor is rooted in a very real, very specific act of mass poisoning of people who were scared, manipulated, and in many cases physically forced. So when we talk about Jonestown now, especially in a true crime context, there's a responsibility to see beyond the meme. To remember that a lot of the people who died were elderly black church members who just wanted a safe community. That many were kids born into a situation they never chose. That some of the adults who survived did so by hiding in the jungle, running into the bush when the chaos started, or being away on an errand in Georgetown that day, and that they've lived every day since with survivors' guilt and the weight of questions that may never fully be answered. In the years after the massacre, investigations and inquests tried to piece together what happened and who, if anyone, beyond Jones and his inner circle, should be held legally responsible. There were debates over whether the U.S. government could or should have intervened sooner, whether Guyanese authorities missed warning signs, and how to repatriate and bury the dead in a way that honored their humanity. Families filed lawsuits. Some survivors turned inward. Others became outspoken advocates for understanding cult dynamics, so nothing like this would happen again. For wherever you're watching from, whether you think that could never be me, or you see echoes of Jonestown in smaller, less deadly groups, the mechanics are worth paying attention to. Charismatic leader with a message that speaks directly to people's wounds. Real acts of service that build trust. Gradual isolation from dissenting voices. Financial and social entanglement that make leaving hard. An us versus them narrative where outside criticism proves the leader must be right. Loyalty tests that force members to override their own instincts. Escalating talk of martyrdom or dying for the cause. By the time it becomes overtly life-threatening, the trap has already been laid. If there's anything to carry forward from Jonestown beyond the horror, maybe it's this: that communities offering hope and equality are vital, but so are boundaries, transparency, and accountability. Any group, religious or political or social, that demands absolute loyalty to a single leader, cuts you off from people who question it, and frames your doubts as betrayal instead of conversation deserves a hard, honest look. In that jungle clearing in Guyana, the buildings of Jonestown are gone now. The wooden cottages and the pavilion have rotted away. The vines and trees have taken back the land. But the story hasn't faded. It lives in the families who still set an empty place at the table in November. In survivors who still wake up from nightmares hearing Jim Jones' voice on the loudspeakers. In the way we use or misuse the phrase "drink the Kool-Aid." And in the uneasy realization that this wasn't a story about those crazy people over there. It was a story about very human hopes, twisted by one man's hunger for control, reshaped by a system that rewarded charisma and looked away from abuse, and sealed in a jungle where there was nowhere left to run. The people who died in Jonestown weren't characters in a cautionary meme. They were our fellow citizens. And the most chilling part of their story isn't that they died together in the jungle. It's how many small, almost reasonable steps it took to get them there.